Our final speaker is Michael Cosson. Michael stopped eating animals about 6 years ago and shortly thereafter began doing activism for animals focused on targeting companies to try to get them to change their ways. He soon realized that the depravity that animals experience is supported by more than just the farms and the companies that supply their products, and has tried to guide animal activism worldwide towards a focus on getting normal, everyday people to understand the power they have to begin to treat animals with decency. He has worked with existing animal rights organizations to put more focus onto individuality of the animals they seek to protect. Michael has a master's degree in physics and has been working to improve the lives of abandoned rabbits at Rabbitat's Rescue Society in Richmond. Welcome, Michael.
So I know everyone's hungry. I'm hungry too. I'll try to keep this short. My points are very simple anyway. Thank you very much, Jen, and thank you, Frank, for making that wonderful film. I think your film has gone some of the way in solving a mystery that vegans struggle with, and that is, why is it that otherwise decent people are willing to cause so much harm to animals? Next slide, please. Disconnection goes a long way to explain it. And the more I think about it, the more ways I see it existing. We're disconnected from the costs our ways of life force onto others. The view that we see is disconnected from the whole reality of the situation. And the biggest, most harmful disconnection is the one between what we know we should do and what we actually do. Next slide. So this is our most common perception of the animal agriculture industry. This is all we see. The product. Next slide. But this is the cost. A life. A whole world. A betrayal. And this is one of those small family farms, by the way. I want to emphasize this. These images I took from a video released by Homesteader. Released not by activists, but by the farmer himself, showing what he considers to be the ideal. Now, Frank's film showed the factory farms mostly, and that's what activists like to show, but I think it's important to look at the ideal too, because even if you're nice to an animal for a little while, that doesn't make it right to take their life. That is the real cost, a whole life. Next slide, please. So this is something you'll never see, right? The farmers who talk about how humane their farm is, volunteering to experience what their animals experience.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Did they die?
No, this obviously is not real. But
These are vegan memes.
yeah, this is a meme. The biggest cost we force animals to pay isn't the inhumane treatment that we see in the factory farms. It's their entire lives. For the dairy cow, the cost is her calf, who she really makes the milk for, the calf who's taken away, so the milk can be sold to us instead. For the dairy cow, the egg-laying hen, the pig, the fish, as soon as they stop producing enough of whatever we want to take from them, or as soon as they grow big enough for their meat to be worth enough, the cost is their lives. This is the worst part. Next slide. Our perspective is sometimes blocked by the walls or the distances from us to the farm. This is the case here in the West. Other countries are a bit more honest about it. Next slide. More commonly, though, our perspective is distorted by the magnitude of the situation. This is what we see when we think of farming. We see suffering, we see lots of it, but it's not to anyone in particular. And this is a distortion that even affects animal rights activists. When we look at stuff like this is what we say we're fighting against, but images like this can make us forget that every single little dot there is a whole life, a whole animal with their own story, their own reason for living, their own personality. Next slide. We saw the monstrosity of animal agriculture. We saw the industry all at once. And for years we thought that if we yelled loudly enough, next slide, if we marched hard enough, if we disrupted enough, the animal agriculture industry would be smashed, or at least we'd start to see it diminish. Next slide. But we didn't see that. In fact, we see it growing. And a lot of us started to lose hope. We might never see our goals. We might never see a vegan world. We might never see a world where animals are treated with decency. But maybe our perspective is distorted as well. Maybe our very goals are a distortion. You see, we can't be responsible for crushing all of animal agriculture. We can never do that ourselves. And maybe someday we will, but along the way, there's a more important goal. There's every individual life. We can take on the responsibility to have these conversations that need to be had, to explain to people what is happening and the power they have over it, and to remember that every single life that is spared when someone decides to go vegan has infinite worth to the one that life belongs to. Next slide. This is what our activism looks like now, explaining, negotiating, one by one, getting people to spare the animals that would have been killed and remembering that every life is a whole world. The activists that have stuck with it, the kind of activism that has happened consistently every week or every 2 weeks, is the kind that does this, that remembers the individual. So I hesitated to put this next part in. I gave a talk a few months ago that had this part, and I'll just warn you, it was a bit hard for me to get through, so I apologize in advance. Next slide. Okay, this is Isla. Sorry. This is Isla. She was a rabbit that I adopted along with Morgan that you see in the cage there in the back. I adopted them from Rabbitats almost exactly a year ago. Isla, I know, was being raised either for meat or for fur or for both. She was one of those animals that we breed for meat. We know this because when she was surrendered to the shelter along with many other rabbits, it was a shelter in Coquitlam, it was a whole truck full of them, and the person started grabbing them by their ears. We think that for some reason the breeding operation got out of control. Next slide. So there's her and Morgan. Morgan's a very large rabbit, but it's pretty rare for rabbits to bond together as quickly as they did. And you'll see in a second, it's a double bond. You just saw Morgan grooming Isla, and here's Isla asking to be washed as well, and there he goes. They had very different personalities. Morgan was always well taken care of. He was always somebody's pet. I think he belonged to an old woman who just got too old to take care of him. But Isla came from a much worse situation, and of course I could see it. For one, she was, of course, more scared. In that last scene where you saw her leave the carrier, that was probably the first time that she ever was in a space bigger than a 5 by 5 foot enclosure. She also had respiratory problems. She had an eye issue that we were never able to diagnose, and I believe that indirectly caused her death a few months after I got her. One time after I had her out in the yard, I brought her in and I gave them their pellets, like I always did, and Isla started choking. And it took about 30 minutes for her to die. It was an esophageal blockage, not a respiratory blockage. And I was on the phone with the shelter, with the shelter owner and the manager. But the whole time she was fighting for her life. She was trying to breathe, but in the end, she didn't make it. Next slide, please. The reason I had to show that is because Isla is no different from the animals that we willingly kill for food and for all the other reasons. They all have their own reasons for living. They all have the desire to continue living just like she did. And while Isla's death is very personal to me, every one of these deaths, every one of these animals that is killed is equally tragic. Even though they're meant to be killed for food, she was meant to be killed for food as well. And so when I do activism, when I talk about why we should go vegan, yeah, I take it personally. And my activism is a bit different for that reason. When I ask people to go vegan, I take that personally as well. And I ask people that because I know they can be better. Next slide. So we'll talk about some more disconnections. As horrible as this all is, it's easy to forget. And I think the main reason is that I think the one argument that Paul brought up, that's the most powerful, that's the one that people use to most commonly separate themselves from going vegan, is the fact that it's normal, that you're surrounded by people who are also not vegan. And yeah, when you think about it, it's this horrible thing that's happening to animals, but how bad can it really be if everyone around you is doing it? And everyone around you, they're all good people, right? You've seen them help others, you've seen them go out of their way to sacrifice their time, their energy, maybe to help you. And yet they eat meat, so is it really such a bad thing? Next slide. So I think the best way to conclude this whole thing is to talk about the biggest, most prevalent disconnection. I think the speakers that came before me, and Frank's film especially, did a great job of explaining why to go vegan. I think if you don't understand why it's the right thing to do, then you must have been asleep, because they did a really good job of explaining that. But there's the philosophical conclusion that it's the right thing to do. And then there's the action. Now, when you think about the action, the idea of going vegan, I understand that it's scary. That is a big change, right? It's a change that will be there for your whole life. It will affect every single meal you have from now on. It will affect your relationships. Your friends will continue eating meat. They'll ask you why you're not. You'll be different. But let me tell you from experience, it's the change that's the hard part. Going vegan is much harder than being vegan. But what's really the hard part is what happens if you don't change. What happens to the animals? Now, there will be no consequence for you if you don't go vegan. The consequences are not yours to bear. The choice is yours, but the consequences are not yours. The consequences belong to the animals. There will never be a law against animal agriculture, I don't think, not in our lifetime at least. The animals themselves will never retaliate against you, and that's because we use the most vulnerable, weakest animals there are. The ones that trust us, those are the ones that we use for food. So there will be there's the health benefits, but the benefits don't belong to you if you go vegan. The consequences don't belong to you if you don't. And that's what we're asking you to do. We're asking you to make a change, to be unusual, to be better. And I understand that most of the meat eaters here were brought here or asked to come here by people who care about them, by people who see that they can be better, who believe in them. And I ask you to do it for them as well. We'll go to the next and final slide. Sorry, there's one more slide I forgot about. So a lot of people's responses when we do outreach, when we give these talks is, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You've convinced us to reduce the amount of meat that we consume. But that doesn't really make sense, because if you believe that this is wrong, then you must accept that even eating a little bit of meat is wrong, because every time you do that, every time you consume dairy, meat, eggs, all the other stuff, that's an animal that's being exploited or killed. That's an entire life. And also, it turns out, based on research, people who make goals that are more strict, it's counterintuitive, but those are the people who are more likely to stay with those goals. If you commit to eating less meat, you're actually less likely to adhere to that weaker commitment than if you commit to going vegan. And I think the reason is because if you have this belief that unnecessary killing is wrong, every time you attack that belief by consuming meat anyway, by buying an egg, by buying dairy, you're attacking your own conscience, you're weakening it. And soon it gets weak enough to where you go back to how you were before. So That's why the ask is to go vegan. Next slide, please. This is the point I think I want everyone to remember. When we show these documentaries, when we show videos on the street, when we talk about this, you see, this is the same movie theater screen that you might have watched The Avengers or any other movie, all the movies that are clearly not real. And everything you saw today, it was just on a screen, right? It's easy to forget that this is all stuff that is really happening. Animals are actually experiencing knives going into their throats. Mother cows are actually experiencing their babies being taken away. And this is actually happening or not happening by your choices. This is all real. This is urgent. And so I believe that each and every one of you has it in you to never be the reason this happens again. Look around you. Look around you at all the vegans here. Any reason that you have to think that you can't go vegan and that you can't go vegan right now, well, all the people who are vegan, at least one of them has that same reason, had that same obstacle, and they overcame it. So talk to your friends who brought you here. Talk to the dietitian. Read the books. Do whatever it takes, because the consequences are so horrible. And this is all real. Thank you.
That deserves a standing ovation. That was touching.